In Burgundy, at the foot of the Morvan Massif, lies Autun, a peaceful town of 15,000 inhabitants. In antiquity, this city was called Augustodunum. With its 6 kilometers of ramparts, it was one of the largest and most monumental capitals of Roman Gaul.
It was an extremely important city. It was the equivalent of Marseille, Toulouse, or Lille today.
Augustodunum was the capital of the Aedui tribe, powerful Roman allies. Their monuments showcased their prestige, like the 20-meter-high Temple of Janus, or this 20,000-seat theater, the second largest in the entire Roman Empire. Next to it stood an amphitheater now gone, but just as colossal.
The amphitheater of Autun was almost as big as the Colosseum.
There was really this idea that Autun was the French Rome. As a matter of fact, Autun's motto was Autun, sister and emulator of the city of Rome.
At the beginning of the 1st century AD, the Aedui met the incredible challenge of building this French Rome from scratch in less than 100 years. At every step, they had to confront the rugged terrain. The city's aqueduct required especially impressive technical innovation.
To cross this slope, they built what could be called a hydraulic staircase. It was truly a colossal job.
Many exceptional monuments still lie hidden under the modern city of Autun. In recent years, new technology has helped archaeologists make astonishing discoveries. From a huge 5-hectare sanctuary at the gates of the city to the Menian schools, the very first universities built in Gaul.
In terms of volume, it's a monument that's perfectly comparable to the Palais Royal in Paris.
It's really an exceptional place that has no equal anywhere in Gaul.
In the city, entombed in a necropolis, genuine treasures were discovered, gradually revealing the secrets of these remarkable people.
When we lifted the lid, there was an amalgam of sludge, and when we looked under the lid, we found the gold fabric. That's when we knew right away that this was something extraordinary.
Today, thanks to cutting-edge computer-generated reconstructions and the latest archaeological discoveries, Gaelic Rome is ready to be reborn. In the year 52 BC, when Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, this territory was divided between about 100 different peoples. Among them were the Aedui, who controlled an area of about 23,000 square kilometers in present-day Burgundy. At the Stone Museum of Autun, one can still see the funerary steles of this illustrious people who left a strong imprint on the history of Gaul.
The Aedui were, among all the Gaelic peoples, the oldest allies of Rome dating to the 2nd century BC. They were even called brothers of the Roman people.
It was a unique title that no other people possessed, except perhaps for 1 or 2 exceptions in the Mediterranean. This title was granted because the Aedui controlled a very particular territory that allowed access to different rivers in Gaul.
The Aedui territory was indeed very strategic, at the crossroads of the major waterways of the Loire, the Seine, and the Saône. Allies of Rome and open to the world, the Aedui were a powerful people with a prestigious capital, Bibracte, perched on Mount Bouvray in the Morvan Massif. But at the end of the 1st century BC, with the Roman Empire offering new trade opportunities, Bibracte quickly showed its limits.
Bibracte was located on the top of a hill, which made it relatively difficult to access.
In terms of trade, traffic, and transportation, it was more convenient to be on the plain rather than on the mountain in Bibracte.
Around the year 13 BC, new Emperor Augustus offered the Aedui an exceptional privilege, that of building a new, more accessible capital in the valley. This new city would take the name of Augustodunum, now Autun.
The name Augustodunum indicates that Augustus was the founder, so the first element is that he was the patron behind the actual founding of the city.
This doesn't mean that Augustus decided everything and that he was the origin of all the constructions, but it's a very clear signal that shows the Aedui were allies of Rome.
The founding of Augustodunum was part of a global project by Emperor Augustus, who wanted to reorganize Gaul. At the same time, the Romans built a sprawling road network that connected the main Gallic cities. This was the Agrippa network.
It was a clear choice to put in a space where the new city would be more connected to the much-vaunted Agrippa road network. They settled where everyone passed through on their way to Boulogne, to Lyon, and vice versa.
To develop its trade, Augustodunum was therefore built on the road linking Lyon to Boulogne, 25 kilometers from Bibracte. But was this strategic positioning really the only reason for choosing this specific location? In 2018, under the impressive Temple of Janus, archaeologists discovered a new explanation, calling into question what had been assumed about the founding of the ancient city. At the gates of Autun, the Temple of Janus is one of the most imposing and best preserved monuments in the city. Built at the end of the 1st century, these walls stand at the vertiginous height of 24 meters, the equivalent of a modern 9-story building.
It's emblematic because it's one of the best preserved in Gaul. That building is truly typical of Roman Gaul.
We called on an archaeologist specializing in 3D modeling to reconstruct this temple exclusively from the various clues revealed by excavations. These walls are what remain of the cella, a large tower measuring 19 meters wide by 24 meters high, here restored to its original colors.
This great tower actually corresponds to the sacred part, the holiest of them all. In other words, it was a space reserved for deities, in which only priests could enter.
You have to imagine a very high ceiling space since there was no floor. It's about 20 meters all the way to the roof, so an extremely large space, but illuminated only by natural light from 3 windows per side.
Solidly erected, the walls of the cella were 2 meters thick. However, we can see 3 large orifices in their lower part. These are thinner parts of the wall that collapsed over the centuries. And for good reason. At the time, there were wide niches dug along the inner walls.
Niches were dug in the very thickness of the masonry and allowed them to accommodate a number of statues.
But the Temple of Janus was not limited to the cella. Another clue can be found on the outer sides of the walls at a height of 8 meters. There are small, square-shaped orifices delimited by brick and meticulously aligned.
We have these holes that correspond to the location of the beams of the framework, meaning the gallery that went all around the cella. That's very interesting because it gives us the height of this gallery, about 8 meters, give or take.
The excavations around the cella allowed to get a better understanding of the structure of this gallery in which the Aedui came to pray. 8 meters wide, this colonnaded, covered gallery framed the cella. Around the building, the sanctuary comprised a large inner courtyard with a total area of 2,400 square meters. But the Temple of Janus had many other secrets to reveal. In 2018, archaeologists excavated under the foundations of the Gallo-Roman temple. At a depth of 1.5 meter, they detected the remains of a wooden structure that was burned before the stone temple was built on top of it.
Carbon-14 dating was carried out, and according to the dating elements available, the structure dated back to the 3rd century BC. That's obviously very early.
The 3rd century BC was indeed 2 centuries before the founding of Augustodunum. This discovery is significant because until then, no such early remains had been found on the site of the city.
One of the big questions that arises about the site of Augustodunum is what motivated the implantation of the city. In other words, why did they choose this location?
The answer to this mystery can be found in the collection of the Autun Department of Archaeology. In 2018, under the current Temple of Janus, the team, led by Philippe Barral and Martine Joly, discovered these miniature terracotta vases that also date back to the 3rd century BC.
What's characteristic is that this type of vase, of very small dimensions, isn't found in habitats. This miniaturization phenomenon is strictly related to cultural activities and ritual practices.
2 centuries before the founding of Augustodunum, there was already a temple linked to a Gaelic deity here. The site of the city was thus chosen for both strategic and religious reasons.
The location chosen for the new Aedui capital was likely determined by the existence of a very old place of worship that already attracted many pilgrims.
Augustodunum was founded a mere 200 meters from the Gaelic sanctuary. Here, the Aedui started building their ideal city from scratch. A huge area of 200 hectares, as extensive as the city of London was in antiquity.
Augustodunum had the particularity of being built ex nihilo and was therefore founded from scratch.
There was a desire to start with virgin land and build a city that would impress.
But how did the Aedui build such an impressive city? The project promised to be complex, as the chosen site was far from ideal.
The site wasn't at all appropriate. You could even say it was unsuitable for the establishment of a very large city.
Augustodunum was built on a plateau that presented certain difficulties. First, it was constrained on all sides by rivers. To succeed in creating 200 hectares of city, the rampart was positioned as close as possible to the rivers, giving the ancient city its unique diamond shape.
The diamond shape was determined by the topography. They set up the city on the maximum amount of territory that could be built on.
Second problem. The plateau was sloped with an altitude difference of 90 meters between the top and bottom of the city. Inside the ramparts, the natural site had to be considerably remodeled with gigantic earthworks.
They had to level the ground, and it was a huge job since everything was done by hand. This element isn't particularly spectacular, as it ends up being buried. It's not necessarily visible, but it represented a titanic work over the 200 hectares of the city.
With its walls culminating at 11 meters, the enclosure supported this huge artificial platform. Inside the city, the altitude was indeed up to 5 meters higher than outside. For 2,000 years, the rampart has always retained this essential function by merging more and more with the modern city.
Quite simply, it had a strong structural role. It retained the land inside the city. We have a set of buildings that are located in the very vicinity of the rampart, and that would be destabilized if it were removed.
To accomplish this role, the rampart had to be very solid. Its exceptional conservation now makes it possible to visualize the heart of this 2.5-meter-thick structure in 3D. The middle consists in a very stable core composed of granite fragments bound to mortar. Each side features 2 facings made of granite and fine sandstone with rubble carved into a very particular shape.
It's like a layer of corn kernels. They're cut in such a way as to be stuck inside the cement core, at the heart of the masonry, to effectively ensure its cohesion.
To build the 6 kilometers of the enclosure, it took 500,000 tons of materials, mostly sandstone and granite of local origin, the equivalent of 10,000 trucks. While the layout of the enclosure was one of the first operations to be carried out on the site of Augustodunum, it took decades to complete its construction.
At first, the framework was created, and you can imagine that it would take several decades to build. If we take the example of the enclosure, it's estimated that construction began in 15 BC and ended around the year 50 AD.
If the rampart was impressive, the gateways to the city were even more so. To enter Augustodunum, there were 4 monumental gates, including the Porte d'Arroux to the north of the city, believed to be the first to have been completed. The builders thought on a grand scale, with a door measuring 17 meters high and 19 meters wide, as well as a very elaborate decor.
Interestingly, the decoration of the door was particularly meticulous, precisely because it was right in the middle of the Agrippa Road.
Unlike the enclosure, where rubble was used, this site was even more complex, as large blocks were used that each weighed up to 1.5 tons.
That meant hoisting devices to set up the blocks. But it also involved transport that was much more complex, as well as quarry extraction. The fact that this was more expensive and time-consuming is what made it impressive and monumental.
To build this spectacular gate, the Aedui opted for a material of choice, oolithic limestone. White and dense, this stone has the double advantage of being a good light reflector and suitable for sculpting. It was here, in the quarries of Fontaine, that the Aedui extracted this very special limestone. However, these quarries were far removed from Augustodunum. The builders had to transport 6,600 tons of limestone blocks over 35 kilometers with the means available at the time.
What were the logistics? These materials had to be carried by ox carts. We can imagine that with 15 ox carts working, it took 1 year and 8 months to bring the materials to Autun. It was a true logistical challenge.
Today, the remaining vestiges only give us a small idea of the monument nature of the Porte d'Arros in antiquity. Thanks to the most recent research, we were able to reconstruct this grandiose door that measured 40 meters wide at the time.
What's left of the Porte d'Arros today isn't much. We no longer have the towers that flank this door. We're also missing the inner courtyard that had to be covered by another door.
The first likely functionality of this airlock was to control several flows: the flow of people, the flow of goods, and possibly the taxation of those goods.
Above the wide bays was a 5-meter-high covered upper gallery that served a double purpose.
Even though the fortification wasn't used as a defensive system, all the characteristics were there, including the wall walk. This floor ensured the continuity of the wall walk. It was also likely a technical space used to maneuver the portcullis that existed in some doors. They were opened and closed every day.
The Aedui spared no expense to magnify the outskirts of their city. Inside the ramparts, Augustodunum was just as monumental. But here, ancient remains are very rare, for the most part buried under the modern city. An investigation was necessary to learn how this city was conceived. Founded in 1836, the Aedui Society was one of the pioneers of modern archaeology. Among them was Jean Guadot, who made a decisive discovery in the middle of the 19th century. During excavations, he exhumed the remains of ancient streets perpendicular to each other that created a perfect regular grid.
He realized that most of these axes led to one of the towers of the enclosure. From there, he sought to redraw the city map as it was back in antiquity.
Guadot's map revealed a perfectly ordered ancient city that was very different from the modern one. The streets were standardized according to a square grid that divided the urban space into nearly 150 small islands.
All the discoveries made since then have confirmed this pattern. There's a great coherence between the street network and the implementation of the enclosure.
Very quickly, from the early 1st century, streets were put into place, axes were set up, traced, and ordered, and these little islands would stay in place until the end of the ancient occupation.
Augustodunum was hence born of a unique global project planned from its very foundation. Even in the bowels of the ancient city, everything was thought out down to the smallest detail to ensure solid foundations. We had exclusive access to a Gallo-Roman pipe almost 2 meters wide. It was a collector sewer pipe from the 1st century. 2,000 years later, one can still see the imprint of the immense construction site of the foundation of the city.
Here, we see linear traces that actually correspond to boards. And these boards correspond to the formwork that made it possible to build the vault of this collector sewer.
This sewer was used to collect wastewater from the inhabitants. But that wasn't its only function. As soon as the city was founded, it made it possible to clean up the land by draining groundwater to the outside.
Without this drainage, They would have seen buildings collapse. The terrain would have been totally unstable. That's another aspect of the well-thought-out network. They anticipated the constructions that would be built above these sewers.
For the engineers who built Augustodunum, water control was essential. In order for water to flow through the city, 2 aqueducts were built. In particular, the aqueduct of Montjoux, some sections of which were discovered during archaeological excavations. This underground aqueduct was a real technical feat, as its water source came from the heights of the Morvan Massif.
The problem with the Autun aqueduct is that at some point, you had to cross a very steep slope. This slope was determined by the mountains that lie south of the city and form a barrier between the spring and the city.
Over the 6 kilometers that the aqueduct travels between the spring and the city, the difference in altitude is very high, an 8% slope on average, with peaks of up to 28%. However, an aqueduct only works properly on a constant and extremely small slope.
According to the Roman architect Vitruvius, the ideal slope measures 0.02%. However, in Autun, the slope is much more significant. In some areas, it's 28%.
Any aqueduct that follows a slope of 28% won't resist very long. The masonry will disintegrate very quickly, as water infiltrates with a considerable power.
Underground, the objective was thus to cut the aqueduct into quasi-horizontal sections. To join the various sections, a drop shaft was built. A hollow, cubic structure measuring 3 meters wide by 6 meters deep. The principle is that of a hydraulic staircase. The water arrives through the upper end of the well before falling into the lower part. After this sudden drop, the current resumes a normal flow.
It required exceptional know-how because they had to build 22 successive wells interspersed with horizontal channels. That means they had to master the typography and the slopes between each duct. It was truly a colossal job.
Drop shafts were very rare in the Roman world, and those of Augustodunum are the largest ever discovered. So much so that they probably required the help of seasoned engineers from Italy. Once again, the Romans and the Aedui demonstrated their joint power.
Establishing such a city with so much effort is a way of domesticating nature. This Roman urban model was so powerful that it was applied even where it was unsuitable.
To stand out, the Aedui also had a taste for gigantism. In Augustodunum, they didn't do things by half, as they built the second largest theater in the Roman world. Of this exceptional monument, only a third of its bleachers remain today, the cavea. But the clues still present on site allow to estimate its gigantic size.
We have an idea of its height, since we can project part of the slopes of the bleachers that were preserved, which would entail a cavea that rises about 33 meters, starting from the lowest level.
Originally, the theater had a diameter of 148 meters and 41 rows of bleachers that culminated at an altitude of 33 meters. In front of the audience and at the same height was a gigantic, elaborate wall, the stage wall.
When we think of theaters in Rome and Gaul, the one in orange notably comes to mind. That one is 103 meters in diameter. It's already extremely impressive, but you have to realize that the one in Autun is 1.5 times larger. You can imagine the gigantic size of the stage wall.
148 meters wide, this theater featured an astonishing capacity of 20,000 seats, the equivalent of a professional basketball arena. In the entire empire, only one theater surpassed it, that of Pompeii in Rome, which measured only a few meters more.
We could expect to have a building that was smaller in size, given the provincial context, which also explains the small differences from that in Rome.
There must have been negotiations so that this theater could be built almost like the one in Rome, but a little smaller, in order to respect the hierarchies and symbolism.
To build such a huge theater, this time the engineers took advantage of the rugged topography of the site by building it on the side of a hill at one end of the city.
There was a hill present at the time, on which part of the stand was directly built, in order to save a certain quantity of building materials. The second row of bleachers was semi-aerial. Only the infrastructure that bear the stands is visible.
Thanks to the remains of Autun, we can better understand how the Aedui built these imposing infrastructures. A wide network of vaults and radial walls supported masonry platforms where the bleachers were then installed. These vaults had a double advantage. They allowed to use fewer materials and also offered circulation spaces to the public.
These vaults also made it possible to set up a certain number of access points to get to the stands. Stairs were present in these corridors that allowed spectators to go from the outside to the inside of the building.
To manage a record attendance of 20,000 spectators, no fewer than 15 staircases were built to lead to the stands.
During a show, this building was teeming with life. It was absolutely necessary to organize the circulation and make it as fluid as possible.
But the theater of Augustodunum wasn't isolated. It was part of a genuine entertainment district. The plans of another huge building were found in the archives of the Aedui Society. At the end of the 19th century, Jean Radeau discovered its remains just 54 meters from the theater.
He probed the ground and found radial walls and elliptical walls. This allowed him to calculate the dimensions of the monuments. 154 meters for the main axis, which was huge.
Right next to an already immense theater, the Aedui built one of the largest amphitheaters in Gaul, able to accommodate 25,000 spectators.
The amphitheater of Autun was bigger than that of Pompeii or Verona. It wasn't much smaller than the Colosseum. It's hard to conceive that instead of the current suburban houses was the equivalent of the Colosseum in Rome.
Little is known about this amphitheater buried under the modern city, but written sources indicate the presence of a gladiator school in Augustodunum, a single mention in Gaul.
It's a rather exceptional note. So we can imagine that there was a real demand and need to have a school to train these gladiators. These were like the superstars in antiquity.
Much like the amphitheater, other equally exceptional monuments have long slept under the modern city of Autun.
There were massive monuments in the heart of the city that have completely disappeared and were totally destroyed, reused, and made completely invisible in the urban space.
To restore them to their splendor, archaeologists had to search for the slightest clue and read the ground to discover sunken wonders. In the collections of the Rolin Museum, the Archaeological Museum of the city, more than 400 fragments of a mysterious monument have challenged archaeologists since their discovery in 1986.
The few fragments show that important care was paid to the decor, to the finesse of it, as evidenced by this rather bright white color.
This is Carrara marble, still recognized today as the most luxurious in the world. Extracted in Tuscany, it was reserved for the most sumptuous monuments, such as the Temple of Mars Ultor in Rome.
This marble was specifically used in monuments in Rome. It wasn't just a matter of having beautiful white marble, but a white marble that came from the emperor's quarries and was reminiscent of the temples of Rome.
Yet archaeologists have discovered these methodically cut and sorted luxurious fragments. From the 4th century on, this extraordinary monument is believed to have been voluntarily cut to pieces so as to reuse its materials.
The building was dismantled and used as a quarry. The building had lost its function and value, so they decided to use it as a quarry and dismantle it.
They didn't really care about where the marble came from. They simply saw it as a large supply of raw materials. That means that of such a huge monument, only a pile of pebbles remain, which were miraculously preserved.
Another clue provided further information about the monument. Waste pickers began to chisel this huge fragment of a capital, an architectural element found at the top of Roman columns. But faced with this marble colossus, they quickly gave up.
This is a third of the initial capital. It's a fragment that weighs 1.3 tons. If we were to reproduce the entire capital, we'd have a single block that would represent about 5 tons of material.
From the size of this capital, a 12-meter-high column can be deducted. That is higher than those of the Parthenon in Athens, measuring an already imposing 10 meters.
This architectural fragment contrasts a little with what's usually found in Gaul. Indeed, comparisons can be drawn with the dimensions of great monuments in the capital of Rome.
Thanks to an inscription discovered on the site, archaeologists believe they have found one of the most prestigious monuments of the city, the Temple of Apollo. This reconstruction shows its 32 12-meter-high columns that frame a circular cella with a vertiginous height of nearly 30 meters.
It was probably one of the monuments that could be seen from the farthest away in the Aedui countryside. It was one of the most visible monuments of Augustodunum, a key part of its identity.
The structures of the temple are impressive, with walls up to 5 meters thick and a total area that spreads over 1,600 square meters.
What was once the Temple of Apollo is nothing today. These are remains that are entirely in the basement, barely visible, barely discernible.
But the site still had more surprises in store for the archaeologists. Only 100 meters from the Temple of Janus, in the middle of the fields, another major discovery took place. In 1976, an aerial photograph of the site stunned the researchers. An exceptional drought revealed the outline of a huge monument buried just a few meters deep.
You have to imagine that under the current small hill, the small mound of earth, there was a huge monument. It marked the ground above it.
The grass dried faster above the remains because the masonry prevented moisture from penetrating deep. The semicircular shape that emerged left no doubt. It was an immense 116-meter-wide theater.
Autun had an urban theater, and here was a second theater of a considerable size as well. It was unprecedented and unexpected. Until then, we never really thought that two theaters existing in the same Roman city was even a possibility, other than in Rome.
The discovery was resounding and raised another question. Were other unknown remains still buried near this second theater? To find out, archaeologists used geophysical surveys, advanced technologies capable of reading underground much more accurately.
We sent a wave through the basement, which reflects in a different way depending on whether it meets masonry or a ditch. The computer translates this and highlights the presence of any infrastructure in the basement.
Between the theater and the Temple of Janus, researchers saw an impressive monumental architectural complex appear that extended over no fewer than 5 hectares, the equivalent of 7 soccer fields.
There were not only 2 monuments. It wasn't only the theater and the Temple of Janus, but an entire neighborhood with streets and monuments. We had no idea this ever existed.
You have to imagine almost a second city outside of Autun, and not just this temple in the middle of nowhere.
For the past 7 years, unprecedented excavations have mobilized every summer about 60 people to exhume this gigantic district at the gates of Autun. Built on this sacred site, it is this sanctuary, one of the largest in Gaul, which guided the growth of the city. Since the founding of Augustodunum, the Gaelic sanctuary vastly expanded, and a huge artisanal district settled right next to it.
There were spaces for people to eat or make purchases. It was similar to certain famous places of worship today. For example, Lourdes, where you can buy souvenirs, medallions, and other similar things.
Many years remain before the excavation of this extraordinary sanctuary can be complete, and new discoveries are to be expected, notably 5 temples that are still buried but have been revealed by geophysical surveys near the Temple of Janus.
Since it's the best preserved, the Temple of Janus is still the flagship element of this religious district. Yet maybe it wasn't even the biggest temple.
But who paid for these ever more disproportionate constructions? While the founding of Augustodunum was decided in Rome, it was indeed the powerful Aedui aristocracy that ordered and financed the monuments of the city.
They wanted to leave their mark on the city and show the power of the Aedui people, since that was the capital.
It was a way for them to self-congratulate on how beautiful their monuments were.
To understand how such a grandiose capital was born, we must unravel the secrets of the rich Aedui. The answers lie in their graves. This skeleton was exhumed from the necropolis of Saint-Pierre-l'Étrier, 2 kilometers from Autun. In the summer of 2020, a team led by Carole Fusurier discovered nearly 230 tombs dating back to the end of antiquity.
The majority of the tombs were empty. However, those that contained artifacts sometimes contained very rich, if not extraordinary, objects.
In one of the most imposing tombs, archaeologists discovered an extremely refined set with a gold ring, and above all, at the feet of the deceased, a set of amber pins of a size and purity never before seen.
This amber is pure, totally translucent. It's orange but translucent, without a single inclusion. We're used to seeing small inclusions, sometimes even insects. These materials were totally new and very rare.
Analyses showed that this amber came from Scandinavia. This gold ring discovered in the same tomb contained a garnet native to India. To acquire such exceptional ornaments, the Aedui did not hesitate to trade remotely, well beyond the limits of the empire. But another tomb revealed even more about the Aedui aristocracy. From it, archaeologists took 17 of these blocks of clay. At first glance, there's nothing special about them. But upon close inspection, they contain an extraordinary clue.
We can see, both in the cracks and on the sides, gold threads that are crossed, braided, and sewn. There are many, and they're everywhere. That's what's extraordinary.
These gold threads are the remnant of a fabric that covered the deceased. Based on the quantities found, this was a garment or shroud entirely woven of gold.
We know of other tombs that contain gold fabrics and embroidery, but nothing has ever compared to this in terms of size. The only example we have of a gold fabric of this size is shown on this mosaic in Ravenna.
This mosaic from the 6th century, representing the court of Empress Theodora, shows a man along her side dressed in a long gold cape. Could the Aedui have also had personal ties to the emperors? A final discovery of a vase called a cage cup seems to confirm this idea. It's a rare piece of goldsmithery, finely carved from a single block of glass. Only 10 complete examples of these cage cups have been discovered so far, and the last one found in North Macedonia was an imperial gift.
We know that this vase was given by the emperor to the person who was buried with it. We can imagine or speculate that the person who had the vase in Augustodunum was perhaps an important person as well, who had the favor of the court.
Not only rich, but also refined and open to the world, the Aedui had an influence that went far beyond the scope of their city. At the forefront of new ideas, the Aedui elites were among the very first promoters of Christianity in Gaul. They were also scholars, as can be seen on this exceptional mosaic featuring Greek philosophers discovered in a domus.
People in the city of Augustodunum had a taste, a particular attraction for culture. It was home to a Greco-Roman culture that was unique in the West.
This taste for culture materialized one last time in the form of a prestigious monument. The Menian schools, monumentalized in the 4th century as a final example of brilliance before the decline of Roman civilization. In 2011, under a parking lot in the center of Autun, archaeologists discovered the remains of these Menian schools, a monument that had eluded them for quite some time. Mentioned in ancient texts, these schools heralded our modern universities.
You could say it was a university center. It was an exceptional place that was present nowhere else in Gaul.
You can imagine young people came from all over Gaul to follow the teachings in Augustodunum. It had a cultural influence on the scale of Gaul itself.
The elements found during the excavations made it possible to restore a gigantic facade with large porticos facing the street. These walls had an exceptional thickness of 3 meters, even more than the enclosure. According to the researchers, this building could have housed a very large library. The inside featured 2 twin open-air courtyards about 20 meters wide and surrounded on all sides by colonnades. This is where the students engaged in physical exercise.
It was a bit like British schools, where they expect you to be as good at rugby as you are at English. It was kind of the same idea. The school trained the elites so they could later lead, whether by word or by force if necessary.
This type of monument dedicated to higher education was very rare in the Roman world, and with its 10,000 square meters, that of Augustodunum is the largest ever discovered.
It has certain characteristics found in other monuments, but in terms of its monumentality, it's completely out of the ordinary.
The building is literally ginormous. It's almost equivalent to Palais Royal in Paris in terms of structure and height. Imagine something of that size.
Yet, like many other prestigious Augustodunum constructions, the Median schools didn't escape destruction. This unique monument lasted only 70 years before ending up as a stone quarry.
70 years later, after 2 or 3 generations, the building was completely destroyed. But not brutally. It was systematically dismantled and all materials were reused.
Autun's hour of glory didn't end with the fall of the Roman Empire. Profoundly remodeled at the beginning of the Middle Ages, the city became an important center of Christianity in France. It wasn't until the 15th century that Autun gradually lost its influence, being too far from the new trade routes. But today, archaeologists continue to make spectacular discoveries about its glorious past, each one adding to the utter uniqueness of this ancient city.
Many things still sleep under the current city and remain to be discovered. Preventative archaeology projects allow us, bit by bit, to refine the vision that we have of the ancient city of Augustodunum.
Too long forgotten, Gaelic Rome continues to draw much deserved attention.